seems difficult to prove, the immortality of the soul. By what arguments or analogies can we prove any state of existence which no one ever saw and which no way resembles any that ever was seen? Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And what he's getting at there is that in terms of classical logic, the sentence, "there is life after death," is a self-contradiction. Because if you look up the words in the dictionary, death just means the final irreversible cessation of life. So the sentence translates to, "there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life," which may seem rather trivial and petty, but if the genuine problem is the rational investigation of the afterlife, it becomes a major difficulty. So, what I need to do now is to give you a little brief thumbnail sketch of the history of logic, which is one of the most fascinating stories of history. But we get it up to Plato, and Plato was the very first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative domain of language. And also, they had, about 100 years before Plato, they had, Parmenides had articulated the notion of truth. That is, truth is that which is the case independently of what anybody thinks about it. And for that reason, Parmenides is called the father of deduction. But about 100 years later, Plato was thinking of it, and he thought, just a minute here. We know that there are some sentences that are the case no matter what anybody thinks, and that's the quality of truth. But he said, so also there are these other sentences that are not the case no matter what anybody thinks about it, and that he defined as falsehood. And in formulating the true-false distinction, he linked it with the literal domain of language. And that's why we say today, the literal truth. Okay? Now, meanwhile, Plato was also aware that this other domain of language, the nonsensical or the unintelligible, was also very important. And in his dialogue on this, makes some very brilliant observations about nonsense. In the next generation, his wonderful pupil, Aristotle, was, to characterize Aristotle, he must have been pretty severely obsessional, as you can tell from reading his will. And he was, anything that smacked of a rationality to him was like this. So when he articulated the logic that we're using in everyday life, he predicated it on the literal domain of language and the true-false distinction. And his favorite word for nonsense was random talk. So he eliminated this strain that had been in Platonism. One thing I think we can see very quickly is that nonsense is not random talk. As a matter of fact, nonsense is less random than ordinary meaningful language. I know it sounds paradoxical, but basically, how should I put this? Well, that's too technical. Let me go on with this other way of putting it. I think most people kind of think of nonsense as, if you think of this as the level of ordinary meaningful language, people think of nonsense as something down here that is sublinguistic. But that is not correct. In fact, nonsense is something that accrues on top of ordinary meaningful language. It's called a supervenient form of language. So it's more complex than ordinary meaningful language. Now, what are we talking about here? Let me start with the definition of nonsense. And the common sense view of what nonsense is all distorted. But if you want to go to the dictionary, you'll see that this is what it means. Nonsense is, number one, language. When the kid is misbehaving and running in a circle or something, stop your nonsense. where we're referring to non-linguistic behavior, that is a secondary sense that's derivative. In primary sense, nonsense is language. Okay? But language which is unintelligible, that is, it conveys nothing clear to the mind and the intellect can't comprehend it. But you know, when you're listening to TV and there's that 404 on the 911 or something, and they say, well, that's there is unintelligible. That's unintelligible because the transmission got mixed up, right? So nonsense is language that is unintelligible because it is meaningless, and that's what it means. And one